Let me tell you something about being an identical twin that nobody who isn't one fully understands. You spend your entire life being perceived as half of something. People who know you both can never fully separate the instinct to compare. Strangers think it's charming and interesting in a way that gets old approximately 1 week after you develop the ability to notice it. And there exists, always, this peculiar intimacy, the knowledge that somewhere in the world there is a person who looks exactly like you, who shares your bone structure and your laugh and the specific way your left eyebrow goes up when you're skeptical, and that this person knows you in a way that no one else ever fully will. What they don't tell you is that this intimacy is also a vulnerability, that being known that completely by someone means that someone also knows exactly how to be you. My sister's name is Lauren. My name is Mara. We are 36 years old. We grew up in Portland, Oregon, the daughters of a high school history teacher and a woman who ran a small bookkeeping business out of our house and smelled perpetually of printer ink and chamomile tea. We were close in the way that twins often are, not the mystical, telepathic closeness that people romanticize, but the practical closeness of two people who have shared every significant environment of their lives, who have the same references and the same formative experiences and the same family dinner table. We finished each other's sentences. We had our own shorthand. We fought with the specific ferocity of people who know exactly which buttons to push because they helped install them. She was always the louder one. I was always the more careful one. These were the grooves we settled into early, and they were comfortable, the way familiar things are comfortable. You stop noticing you're in them until you're very deep. I moved to Seattle for work at 25. I was a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, a job I'd gotten through a combination of a decent finance degree from Oregon State and a genuine aptitude for the particular kind of ordered, pattern-based thinking that financial analysis rewards. Lauren stayed in Portland. She'd had a harder time finding her footing professionally, a few jobs that didn't stick, a period of waitressing, a short-lived attempt at starting an online vintage clothing business that ended with a storage unit full of other people's old denim and a lesson about market saturation. I didn't judge this. Lauren had always been more creative than linear, and the working world has a specific bias toward linear that takes some people longer to navigate. We talked on the phone regularly. We saw each other at holidays and occasionally in between. The shape of our relationship was good, or I thought it was, the comfortable, slightly infrequent contact of two adults who love each other and have their own lives and don't need to be attached at the hip to feel close. I met my husband, Daniel, at 28. We married at 30. He is a structural engineer with an almost comical inability to watch movies without identifying structural implausibilities in the sets, which I find both irritating and completely endearing. He is a good man. This is relevant. The first sign of something wrong came when I was 30, 3 months after the wedding, in the form of a credit card statement for an account I had no memory of opening. I called the number on the back. The account had been opened 2 years earlier, had a credit limit of $8,000, and carried a balance of $7,400. The mailing address on the account was a Portland address I didn't recognize. I assumed fraud. Immediate, impersonal, stranger-type fraud, the kind that happens to people all the time when their information gets skimmed or leaked. I reported it, went through the dispute process, had the account flagged and closed, put a freeze on my credit, filed the relevant reports. It was tedious and unpleasant, and I moved on. 6 months later, a collections call for a medical bill from a Portland clinic I had never visited, then a second credit card, then a notice about an apartment lease in my name at an address that, when I looked it up on Google Maps, was a modest complex on the east side of Portland, the kind of place with outdoor stairwells and a coin laundry room and a small parking lot. At this point, I was no longer thinking identity theft in the impersonal data breach sense. The geography was too specific. Everything was Portland. Everything was in my name but pointing to a life being lived in a city I no longer lived in, with a consistency that suggested not a criminal who'd grabbed my information opportunistically, but someone who was using my information deliberately, over time, with a plan. I hired a woman named Cecilia, a private investigator based in Portland, who came recommended by a friend of a friend and who had the specific no-nonsense energy of someone who has seen every variety of human messiness and is no longer surprised by any of it. I told her what I had and what I suspected, which at that point was still vague. Someone with access to my information, someone local. I did not yet say my sister's name. I wasn't ready to say it, which means part of me already knew. Cecilia came back to me 3 weeks later. She sat across from me on a video call. I was in Seattle, she was in Portland, and she had a folder of documents on her desk, and she looked at me for a moment before she started talking in a way that I have since understood meant she was deciding how to deliver something significant. Then she opened the folder and began. Lauren had been living as me for 6 years. Not constantly, not in every context. She had her own life running simultaneously, her own name in some places, her own social circles, but in a parallel track that had grown more elaborate over time, she had constructed a version of herself that ran on my identity. The apartment was in my name. The credit cards, 4 of them by this point, 2 now closed by my disputes and 2 still active, were in my name. She had used my social security number to get the apartment lease and the cards, and, Cecilia told me, one personal loan of $12,000 from an online lender, of which approximately $9,000 remained outstanding. She had also, and this is the part that made the room feel briefly tilted, applied for a job using my name and my educational credentials. She had not gotten the job. She'd made it to a second interview before something apparently fell through. But the application existed, submitted to a financial services firm in Portland listing my degree, my certifications, my professional history, and her contact information. She had been practicing being me. That's the only way I can frame it. Not wholesale, not in a way that replaced her own life entirely, but as a parallel option she'd constructed and maintained, a version of herself with my foundation under it. And she had done this for 6 years without my knowledge, which means she had sat across from me at holiday dinners and talked to me on the phone twice a month and looked at me with my own face and said nothing. I didn't call her immediately. I sat with it for 4 days, which is both a very short time and an extremely long time depending on which part of those 4 days you're looking at. Daniel knew. I told him the night Cecilia called, sitting on the edge of our bed, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then said carefully, "What do you need right now?" Which is one of the reasons I married him. I said I needed to understand it fully before I did anything, and he said okay, and he gave me the 4 days. I thought about Lauren during those 4 days with an intensity and specificity I hadn't applied to her in years. I went back through our history with new eyes, or tried to, looking for the shape of this, for the moments where her life had veered in ways I might have attributed to her personality or her choices, but which I now saw as possibly pointing toward something else. The inconsistency of her employment, the apartment addresses she'd mentioned that I'd never visited, the financial conversations she'd deflected with a lightness that I'd accepted as Lauren being Lauren, Lauren who didn't like to talk about practical things, Lauren who was creative and spontaneous and unbothered by the structures that I found necessary. Was she unbothered by those structures because she'd quietly borrowed mine? I called her on a Thursday evening. She answered on the second ring, sounding completely normal, warm, slightly distracted, the voice I'd known my entire life. She asked how Daniel was. She mentioned she'd been thinking about coming up to Seattle sometime in the spring. I said, "I need you to tell me why you've been using my name." The silence that followed was approximately 6 seconds long. I counted afterward by replaying the call in my memory. 6 seconds, and then she said, not panicked, not tearful, but in a voice that was very quiet and very flat, "How did you find out?" Not a denial. I've thought about that a lot. Her first response was not to deny it, which means on some level she had always known I would find out, had perhaps been waiting, perhaps even with some relief, for this call. What followed was a 2-hour conversation that was the strangest of my life, which is a significant claim given its competition. She talked. I mostly listened, with the particular stillness of someone who is trying to fully receive something before they respond to it. She told me it had started small. She'd needed to pass a credit check for the apartment, and her own credit was poor from a period of unpaid bills in her mid-20s, and she'd told herself it was temporary. Just to get the apartment, she'd fix it quickly. But the apartment led to needing a card for the security deposit, and the card led to another, and each step was justified by the previous one and by the next necessity, and 6 years passed the way years do when you're inside them, faster than they should, quieter than they should, until they're simply the life you're living. She said she'd told herself I wouldn't be affected because she was managing the accounts, making minimum payments, keeping things from defaulting. She said she'd told herself it was borrowing, not stealing. She said she'd told herself a lot of things. And then she said the thing, the sentence I've turned over in my hands so many times that it's worn smooth by now. She said, "You would have done the same thing." I didn't answer immediately. I thought about whether she was right, and I don't think she was, but I also understood what she meant. Not that I specifically would have, but that she needed to believe anyone would have, that what she'd done was a human response to a human desperation, and not a reflection of something singular and broken in herself. She needed it to be a thing that people do, because if it was a thing that people do, she was still inside the category of people. I told her that she needed to stop, all of it, immediately, that I was going to involve the legal process of repairing my credit and my records, and that this was going to make her situation visible in ways that might have consequences, and that I was not going to shield her from those consequences, but that I was also not going to pursue criminal charges. She asked why not the latter. I said, because you're my sister, and I don't know what that means yet, but it means something. The financial repair took 2 years, not the bureaucratic process. That was closer to 14 months, working with a credit attorney who specialized in identity theft cases and who managed not to visibly react when I explained the identity thief was my twin sister. The 2 years includes the slower work of rebuilding my credit profile, disputing the items that couldn't simply be removed, paying the attorney, and navigating the civil territory of the loan that had been taken in my name and which I ultimately was able to have redirected to Lauren through a legal agreement she signed without contesting. Daniel met with her once during this period, without me. He asked my permission and I gave it, not knowing exactly what he intended. He told me afterward that he'd simply wanted to look at her and tell her that what she had done to me was serious, and that he needed her to understand that his job was to protect me, including from her if necessary. She had listened, he said, and had cried, and had said she knew. I don't know what to do with that, so I've mostly set it down. Lauren and I do not have the relationship we had. I want to be honest about that because I think stories like this sometimes drift toward reconciliation as a conclusion, as if the healing of a relationship is the natural endpoint of a betrayal narrative. We are in contact, occasional, careful contact, a text on birthdays, a phone call every few months that lasts about 20 minutes and covers surface things. She is getting therapy, which she told me in one of those calls, in a voice that was trying to communicate something and not quite landing it. I said I was glad. I do not know if I will ever fully forgive her. I've stopped putting a deadline on it because deadlines imply I have more control over the process than I do. What I know is that she took something from me that was very specific and very intimate, not just my financial identity, but the security of being known safely. The understanding that the person who knows you most completely is also the one least likely to use that knowledge against you. She took that, and she took it in a way that was so particular to twinhood, so close to the closeness we had, that the closeness itself is now the thing I can't fully access without the shadow of it. There is a photograph from our childhood that my mother has on her wall. We're about 7, sitting in a backyard somewhere, both squinting into the sun at the same angle, both with grass-stained knees, both mid-laugh at something outside the frame. Identical in every visible way. I used to love that photo. I still love it, but differently. It's a picture of 2 people who didn't know yet what they would become to each other, who were just 2 small identical faces in the sun. I look at it when I visit my mother and feel something that doesn't have a clean name. My credit score is 791. I checked it last Tuesday, the way I check it every month now, the habit of a person who has learned that vigilance is not paranoia, it is just the cost of what happened. My name is mine again, fully and legally and in every database that matters. My name is Mara. It was always Mara. It took me 2 years and a private investigator and a credit attorney and more grief than I expected to prove that. But it's mine. It was always mine. And so, it turns out, am I.